New York City, January 1965. A cold Tuesday afternoon. Alex Haley sat in the small study of his Greenwich Village apartment, surrounded by stacks of interview transcripts, handwritten notes, and draft pages that represented nearly 2 years of his life. Across from him, in a chair that seemed to barely contain his presence, sat Malcolm X. Between them on the coffee table lay the manuscript of what would become one of the most important books of the 20th century, the Autobiography of Malcolm X. Haley had finished the final chapter. It was a chapter that dealt with Malcolm's death, not because Malcolm had died yet, but because both men understood, without saying it plainly, that the book needed to account for the ending that was coming. Haley had written the epilogue, which described what would happen after Malcolm was gone. He had written it in a way that treated Malcolm's death not as speculation, but as something close to inevitability, something both men knew was being built toward by forces neither fully controlled. Haley asked Malcolm if he could read it to him. Malcolm sat back in the chair, crossed his arms, and said yes. Haley read. The room was quiet. The Greenwich Village street sounds filtered in from outside. Haley's voice was the only sound as he moved through the pages describing Malcolm's isolation, his premonitions, his acceptance that what was coming was beyond his ability to stop, and the meaning that his life would carry after it ended. When Haley finished reading, he looked up. Malcolm was still. His expression showed nothing readable. The silence lasted for what Haley later described as the longest 10 seconds of my life. Then Malcolm spoke. One word, just one, and that word, which Haley recorded in his epilogue and which scholars have been analyzing and debating ever since, is what historians still cannot fully explain, because the depth of what it contained, coming from that man in that room at that moment, still astonishes everyone who thinks carefully about it. Alex Haley and Malcolm X came to their collaboration from wildly different places. Haley was born in 1921 in Ithaca, New York, raised in Henning, Tennessee, the grandson of people who had been enslaved. He had served 20 years in the United States Coast Guard, writing in his spare time, developing a journalism career that eventually landed him at Playboy magazine, where he conducted some of the most celebrated interviews of the era. Haley was patient, methodical, empathetic. He was a listener in the deepest sense, the kind of person who made other people feel understood, which made them say things they hadn't planned to say. He understood that the best journalism wasn't extraction. It was relationship. You earned what you got by showing up consistently, by caring genuinely, by being willing to be changed by what you heard. When Playboy assigned him to interview Malcolm X in 1962, Haley approached the assignment with the same preparation and respect he brought to every subject. He read everything written about Malcolm. He studied the Nation of Islam. He understood the ideological framework. And then he sat down with a man who initially had no interest in being fully understood by a journalist and spent months earning the trust that eventually became something deeper than trust. Malcolm X was not an easy subject. He was suspicious of journalists. He had been misquoted, misrepresented, taken out of context, and deliberately caricatured by American media for years. His public persona was constructed partly as armor, a shield against the kind of selective quotation that had turned complex ideas into inflammatory headlines. He answered questions in ways designed to make him legible to specific audiences, while remaining opaque to those who wanted simple villains. Haley saw through this immediately and was patient enough not to push against it. He let the armor exist. He kept showing up. He asked the same questions in different ways across different sessions, until Malcolm's defenses relaxed enough for something real to emerge. The Playboy interview ran in 1963 and was remarkable, a full, substantive engagement with Malcolm's ideas that treated him as the thinker he was. Afterward, Malcolm's publisher, Grove Press, approached Haley about an autobiography. Malcolm agreed on the condition that the book would contain his words, his story, his framing. Haley agreed on the condition that the book would be honest, that there would be no ideological censorship, no version of Malcolm curated for palatability. The negotiation over those terms, Malcolm's control over his own narrative versus Haley's commitment to journalistic truth, ran through every session of the collaboration, and it produced a book that neither man could have created alone. The sessions between Malcolm and Haley took place over nearly 2 years, from 1963 into early 1965. They met in Malcolm's office at the Nation of Islam's Temple No. 7, In hotel rooms in cities Malcolm traveled to for speaking engagements, in the backseat of cars between airports and venues, in the corridors and waiting areas of transportation hubs during layovers when Malcolm had 20 minutes between one obligation and the next. The settings were never comfortable or private in the way academic biography interviews might be. Malcolm was a man in constant motion, and Haley adapted to that motion, bringing his notepad and his patience to wherever Malcolm happened to be. The dynamic between them evolved slowly from formal to something harder to categorize. Not friendship exactly. Malcolm maintained too much internal distance for conventional friendship, but something like mutual recognition. Haley recognized in Malcolm a mind that operated at a level that made almost every other public figure he'd interviewed seem smaller. Malcolm recognized in Haley a man who was trying to understand rather than simply record. That distinction between understanding and recording was everything to Malcolm. He had been recorded his entire career. Quoted, misquoted, excerpted, contextualized. What he had not been was understood. Haley offered understanding, and Malcolm gradually offered back the raw material of his actual inner life. The collaborative process was not smooth. Malcolm was a moving target ideologically. His philosophy was evolving in real time, leaving Haley with the constant challenge of capturing a man who wasn't the same person from session to session. The Malcolm who spoke to Haley in 1963 was not the same Malcolm who spoke to him in late 1964. Haley faced a constant editorial question. Which Malcolm was he writing? The answer he eventually arrived at was, all of them. The book would trace the evolution, not freeze a single moment. It would show a man becoming, not a man arrived. That decision is what made the book historically indispensable. The most difficult section of the book to write was the ending, not because Haley lacked material, because the ending hadn't happened yet. In late 1964 and early 1965, as the book neared completion, Malcolm's situation had become visibly dangerous. His house had been firebombed. Death threats were constant and increasingly specific. The Nation of Islam's public rhetoric about Malcolm had crossed from criticism into condemnation. Government surveillance was intensifying. Everyone around Malcolm understood what the trajectory pointed toward. Haley sat with a manuscript in January 1965 and wrote the epilogue, the section that would frame Malcolm's life for readers who encountered the book after Malcolm's death. He wrote it as a reckoning, as a witness account, as a record of what Haley himself had observed across 2 years of being in the room with one of the most extraordinary human beings of the century. He described Malcolm's grace, his humor, which was genuine and often surprised people who expected only severity, his intellectual generosity in the sessions, the way he would genuinely reconsider a question if Haley pressed the right point, his love for his daughters, the way his voice changed when he talked about them, softer, more uncertain, less the orator and more the father, and he described the premonitions, the certainty Malcolm carried in his final weeks that he was living on borrowed time and had chosen to spend it speaking. When Haley finished writing the epilogue, he made a decision that had no precedent in his experience as a journalist. He asked Malcolm's permission to read it to him, not to get approval, not to ask for changes, just to give Malcolm the experience of hearing how the story of his life sounded from outside of it. He called Malcolm and made the request. There was a pause on the phone. Then Malcolm said, "Come." Haley arrived at Malcolm's current residence on a Tuesday in January 1965. Malcolm was alone. He'd been doing that more, spending time alone, which was unusual for a man whose life had always been organized around people and meetings and the energy of collective work. They sat in the small study. Haley poured himself a glass of water. Malcolm sat in the chair and waited. Haley opened the manuscript to the epilogue, and he read. The reading took about 30 minutes. Haley read slowly, giving the words their weight. He read about Malcolm's childhood, reduced to a few essential images that carried the whole story. He read about the prison years and the transformation there. He read about the Nation of Islam years and the break. He read about Mecca and the revelation of a wider humanity. He read about the final weeks, the threats, the firebombing, the exhaustion, the continuing speech. And he read the final paragraph, which described what Malcolm represented to the people who had listened to him. Not comfort, not easy answers, but the insistence that truth required speaking regardless of cost, and that the cost Malcolm paid was proof of the truth's importance. Haley read the last sentence and looked up. Malcolm was still. His arms were crossed as they had been when Haley started reading. His face showed nothing immediately readable. The expression wasn't blank. It was too still for blankness, which is a kind of absence. This was presence. Deep, concentrated presence. The expression of a man who has just heard his own life described from outside, and is deciding what to do with that. The 10 seconds of silence that followed felt, Haley wrote, like the silence at the end of something very long and very important, when the sound stops and the meaning hasn't quite arrived yet. And then Malcolm spoke. One word. The word was finished. Haley looked at him. Malcolm didn't elaborate. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at the window. He said, "It's a good book, Haley." And then he asked if Haley wanted tea. That was the end of the exchange about the epilogue. Malcolm never asked to change a word, never requested additions or deletions, never expressed disagreement with the framing or the emphasis. Just finished. And then tea. Historians have been debating the meaning of that single word ever since the book was published in 1965, just months after Malcolm's assassination. The debate runs in multiple directions simultaneously. The first interpretation is the simplest. Malcolm was confirming that the book was done, that the project he and Haley had been working on for 2 years had reached its completion, finished, as a statement of fact about the manuscript. This interpretation is satisfying in its simplicity and almost certainly wrong, or at least incomplete, because Malcolm was not a man who used single words to state obvious facts. He was a man who used language with extraordinary precision, who chose words the way a surgeon chooses instruments for specific purpose, specific effect, specific meaning. When Malcolm said one word after 30 minutes of listening to his own life story, the word was not casual. The second interpretation is darker and more resonant. Malcolm was saying that he himself was finished, that the epilogue Haley had just read had confirmed what Malcolm already knew, that the trajectory described in that document, the threats, the premonitions, the certainty, pointed toward an end that was close. Finished, not as completion of the book, but as acknowledgement of his own approaching death. This interpretation is supported by everything that followed in the next weeks. Malcolm's behavior in January and February 1965 was consistent with a man who had made peace with his ending. The third interpretation, and the one that most astonishes historians, is that both meanings were simultaneous. That Malcolm said finished, knowing it contained both truths at once. The book was done, and so, approximately, was he, and he chose to hold both in a single word rather than separate them, because separating them would have been less true. Alex Haley published the Autobiography of Malcolm X in November 1965, 9 months after Malcolm's assassination. The book was an immediate sensation and has never gone out of print. It has sold tens of millions of copies across dozens of languages. It has been called, by scholars in multiple fields, one of the most important American autobiographies ever written. By educators, it has been called one of the most transformative books a young person can read. By historians, it has been called an essential document for understanding the civil rights era's complexity. The book's power comes from exactly what Haley described in his epilogue. The portrait of a man becoming, not arrived. A man whose ideas were in motion, even as the forces arrayed against him were coming to stillness. Malcolm X never read the published version. He was killed on February 21st, 1965, before the book went to press. But he heard it. 30 minutes in a small study in January 1965, with Haley reading and the Greenwich Village street sounds coming through the window. He heard how his life sounded from outside. He heard the shape of his own story. And he said one word. Haley spent the rest of his life writing and speaking about the collaboration. He wrote Roots in 1976, which became a cultural phenomenon equal in impact to the autobiography. He won awards, received honorary degrees, gave lectures at universities around the world. But when interviewers asked him about the most profound moment of his career, he returned again and again to that Tuesday in January 1965. The small study, the manuscript, the 30 minutes of reading, the 10 seconds of silence, the one word, finished. Haley died in 1992, 7 years before the 20th century ended, a dozen years before scholars would fully canonize both him and the book he'd helped create. He never fully resolved. He said in his final interviews what Malcolm meant by that word. He had spent nearly 30 years turning it over, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the bottom of it. I think, Haley said in one of his last recorded conversations, that Malcolm said the only word that could contain everything he was feeling in that moment, and that word was too large for any of us to fully hold. He knew it was finished. The book, him, the particular chapter of history he'd been living in, he knew it was all completing itself. And he said the word that covered it, just the one word, because that was enough. Malcolm never used more words than necessary. That was one of the things about him that I tried to capture in the book and never fully managed. He was more economical with language than anyone I've ever known, except at that moment. At that moment, one word was exactly right. The Autobiography of Malcolm X sits in archives, libraries, private collections, school bags, prison cells, and nightstands around the world. Malcolm's voice is in it, reconstructed through Haley's writing, but recognizably his, the cadence and the precision and the refusal to offer false comfort. The book is dedicated, in its published form, to Betty Shabazz and their daughters. The epilogue, which Haley read aloud to Malcolm in January 1965, is the last section of the book, and it ends with Haley's description of Malcolm's funeral. For 100 people in the streets, the body carried through Harlem, the mourners who had never met him feeling particular grief of losing someone who had articulated something essential. The epilogue ends with a quiet, powerful sentence about legacy. It does not use the word finished, but that word is in every line of it. Malcolm heard the epilogue in January. He said one word, and then he asked if Haley wanted tea. That ordinariness after the extraordinary is perhaps the most Malcolmian thing about the whole exchange. Here is the story of your life and the shape of your death. Here is what it means and what it will mean after. Here is the record. And now, would you like tea? Because the work continues until it doesn't. And while it continues, you make tea, and you move forward, and you say the true things, until the day you can't anymore.